Well, thank you, Philip, for that kind introduction. Thanks to the Jubilee Center for the invitation to be here today. And indeed, thanks for all the good work you do here at the Jubilee Center. It's been a great benefit to me and to, I know, many in Cambridge and really around the world. The biblical thinking that you foster and produce on critical issues of our day. And today we'll be looking at one of those critical issues. As the horrific, tragic attacks in Sri Lanka have just reminded us, religious persecution is an ongoing and pervasive and serious global challenge. But also, as we've learned more about what happened in Sri Lanka and have seen the debates that are now unfolding about what happened and what to do about it, we realize afresh what a complicated and contested issue religious persecution is. In many ways, it was a bizarre attack. Muslim-Christian relations in Sri Lanka, on the whole, have been fairly positive in recent years. Muslim communities there face a lot of the same sorts of problems and discrimination that Christian communities face. The Catholic Church has been comparatively well treated in Sri Lanka. It tends to be evangelical churches that suffer most discrimination. So this sort of high-profile attack against Catholic targets by people acting in the name of Islam is a really strange and, of course, tragic thing. What I thought I would do in my time today is share a little bit about the background and process of how this paper came to take its final form. And I'm just seeing the hard copy in person for the first time. I'm delighted by how it looks and grateful to the Jubilee Center for publishing it. Then I'll summarize the key points in the paper, and then finish with some of the practical implications that I touch on at the end of the paper. By way of process, when Chris Townsend from the editorial committee first asked me to write something on this general topic, I conceived of it as a way to stitch together several arguments that I've made in editorials on religious freedom issues over the past few years. Most of those editorials are around 800 words. A Cambridge paper is 4,000 words. So I thought, I'll just stitch together a sort of compendium of Judd's greatest hits on religious persecution, if one can have such a thing. But as I got into the writing, to the reading, and especially the engagement with the editorial committee, it became quite clear to me this wasn't just a place to string together a number of top tips, but rather a place to offer a more fulsome biblical and theological reflection on the issue of persecution writ large and on the particular pitfalls that I highlight in the paper. The whole process pushed me to dig deeper into what the Bible and Christian tradition has to say about religious freedom and how not to promote it. And I must say, too, that the engagement with the editorial committee wasn't just editorially helpful. It was actually quite spiritually edifying. You don't often say that about editorial meetings, but it's a wonderful, wise group, and I really enjoyed the interaction with them. Another stream that factored into the creation of the paper was the reading group on Protestant political theology that we host at Clare College. And that process has pushed me to go back to 16th and 17th century sources to consider the full span of Protestant reflection on the state, on the nation, on issues related to religious toleration. For me, as an American and as someone who wrote his PhD thesis on Barack Obama, pretty much anything before the 21st century is ancient history to me. So having to consider the 16th and 17th centuries has been a growing experience for me. And right at the same time that we were beginning that reading group and looking at Luther and Beza and others, I found myself in Basel, Switzerland, just kind of meandering the streets while my wife was in a meeting, and happened across the memorial plaque to Sebastian Castellio, and the picture of that plaque is on page 2 of the paper. And engraved on it is Castellio's famous denunciation of persecution, where he says, "To kill a man is not to protect a doctrine, but is to kill a man." You see, if you're trying to protect ideas by harming people, really all you're doing is harming people. So that's a bit of the background to this. And as Philip mentioned, I spent several years at the State Department working in the Religious Freedom Office, and I saw countless examples of my fellow Christians falling into these sorts of pitfalls that I talk about in the paper when they try to engage religious freedom issues. So that's some of the process and the background. Now, some summary of the paper. I'm someone who rarely does the reading in advance for a conference or for a seminar. So I'm always grateful when a presenter quite thoroughly recaps their paper. That way I can ask questions and make it sound like I've read the paper in advance. Those of you gathered here are probably much more studious than I am, and you've read it in great detail and have your questions ready. But just in case there are others that are like me who haven't done the reading, I thought I would just go through each of the 7 pitfalls and summarize them for you. The audience I have in mind for the paper is largely Western Christians who are already engaged to some extent on issues of helping the persecuted and promoting religious freedom, whether through prayer, through donation, through just finding themselves clicking on links related to stories on Sri Lanka or Nigeria or Egypt or wherever the latest incidents of persecution may have taken place. So people who are already engaged who may be falling into some of these pitfalls. I start the paper with this anecdote about stumbling across the Castellio plaque. He was a French theologian who spent a good bit of time in Geneva, a close associate with John Calvin, then had a famous falling out with Calvin, spoke out quite forcefully against the execution of Michael Servetus, and in his book Concerning Heretics, Castellio appeals to Scripture, Christian tradition, reason, and experience to try to make the case that protecting conscience from coercion is a moral duty and a practical good. He says that persecuting heretics is incompatible with the teaching and the example of Christ. And he makes an interesting argument extending what Paul says in Romans 14, not to treat with contempt those whose consciences lead them to different practices. Castellio seeks to extend that to Jews and Muslims and others whose consciences lead them to even more fundamentally different beliefs and practices. It's also a practical good to promote toleration. It engenders social harmony. Persecution does not. It fuels social hostility. And I say in the paper that fortunately today there are many Castellios out there who are promoting religious freedom, who are helping the persecuted in a Castellio-like manner, thoughtful, biblically rooted, theologically informed, capacious, ecumenical, thoughtful, brave. But unfortunately there are many people who fall far short of Castellio's example because they fall into one or more of these pitfalls. So let's get into these pitfalls now. My goal in pointing out these 7 pitfalls is not to condemn any particular individual or organization or approach, but rather to commend hopefully a more thoughtful and ultimately more constructive and effective method of helping the persecuted and advancing religious freedom. The first pitfall is ignoring the problem of persecution. I think this needs to be highlighted up front, that even as there are many pitfalls that one can fall into when promoting religious freedom, not doing it at all and being ignorant of the problem, I think it needs to be addressed. And this has, I think, much to do with the fact that the vast majority of Christians today do not live proximate to religious persecution. That's a good thing. But the downside is that a majority of Christians are insufficiently aware, insufficiently engaged with matters of persecution and religious freedom. My friend Todd Johnson at the Center for the Study of Global Christianity has calculated, and this is from memory, I think it's accurate, it's something like 20% of Christians today live in contexts where they are suffering or in danger of suffering severe persecution. So fortunately 80% of us are not, but those of us in the 80% can often be glibly unaware of the suffering of the 20%. And this leads to our attention deficit. Here I think a helpful biblical corrective is the body metaphor. In 1 Corinthians 12:26 it says, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. I do have a caveat in this section of the paper saying that we don't want to give the impression that every individual Christian or every individual congregation has to put helping the persecuted or promoting freedom at the very top of their agenda. There's so many issues to be involved in as an individual, as a congregation. We shouldn't feel somehow deficient if we're not putting religious freedom at the very top of our list. Again, I think the body metaphor is relevant here. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 12, for as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. That leads to pitfall 2. In a well-intentioned effort to alleviate this attention deficit to persecution, some religious freedom activists exaggerate the problem or offer highly imprecise accounts of the problem that misrepresent the scale and severity of Christian persecution in any given context. So often we hear descriptions like Christians in country X are being harassed and beaten and imprisoned and killed for their faith. And these descriptions are always are often literally true at a certain level. You can probably find evidence of a beating or an imprisonment or killing in a range of countries, but we don't want to mislead people about the severity of a problem in a given country. That sort of language, frankly, does a better job of raising funds than actually relieving persecution. My normative point here is that in a world awash with fake news and misinformation, Christians need to be people of truth and integrity. Pitfall 3 is uncritical partiality. Related to Pitfall 2, too much activist literature on persecution not only exaggerates the problem, it also shows uncritical partiality or undue credulity towards certain favored groups, namely Christian organizations and persecuted Christians. During my time at the State Department, I met with countless faith-based religious freedom groups that presented pictures of persecution that were partial, that were anecdotal, unverified, dated, sensationalized, over-spiritualized, politically biased, and so on. And that greatly harmed their credibility and harmed the cause on which they're working. And also there's the delicate issue of the credence that we give to those who directly suffer persecution themselves. I say in the paper that it's critically important that we listen to their stories, and also important that we listen critically. Often their accounts can be highly colored by the antagonism that they faced, and we need to ask about ways in which they might have even contributed to that antagonism. Not to blame the victim, but there are methods of engaging other religions or engaging religions that might exacerbate the problems that one faces in a difficult context. The fourth pitfall is neglecting the persecution of non-Christians. I think it's entirely appropriate, again going back to the body metaphor, that Christians have a special concern for those who are fellow members of the body of Christ. But this special concern shouldn't lead to a lack of concern for the suffering of non-Christians. And there are a whole range of principled and pragmatic reasons that we could point to for why this is the case. At the level of principle, I think a core point here is the bedrock commitment Christians have to human dignity, grounded in the image of God, which naturally gives rise to respect for the consciences of each individual. At the practical level, I like the quote from Pope Benedict, who said that religious freedom is a weapon of peace. And indeed, a growing body of social scientific research indicates that there's a strong positive correlation between religious freedom protections and social harmony, reduction in social hostilities, and so on. So I say that a Christian religious freedom advocacy that neglects non-Christians is sub-Christian and short-sighted. Fifth pitfall is mimicking the persecutors of Christians. What I have in mind here is the language that authoritarian governments or monopolistic religious leaders will often use about Christians, saying that Christians in general or certain types of Christians are agents of a foreign power or of a rival civilization, and thus can't be loyal citizens, don't deserve the same sort of legal protection or social privilege in a given context. And sadly, this sort of argument is often made explicitly, more often implicitly, by Christian politicians in the West about Islam. We have to remember that Christians are the minority in 71 countries around the world, and we make life more difficult for those Christian minorities when we mistreat or malign minorities here in the West. The key issue is reciprocity. As Chris Seipel, my former boss at the Institute for Global Engagement in Washington, D.C., once said, "We should all believe in some form of the golden rule, if only because we are all minorities somewhere." And this echoes something Costello said, where a man can be orthodox in one city and a heretic in the next. This leads to the sixth pitfall, as Brits say, the persecution complex in the West. Some Christians here in the West increasingly feel like they are a beleaguered minority. And there's a tendency to present the experience of perhaps minor legal discrimination or social marginalization as somehow akin to the brutal suppression of faith that Christians face in other parts of the world. In the paper, I talk about several reasons why this may have developed. We can get into that during the Q&A. What I do zero in on in this pitfall is the use of the word persecution itself. There is a general sense in which the word can be used to mean any suffering on account of faith. But there's also a much more limited way to use the word, limited to those cases of extreme violent suppression of faith. And as you see in the paper, I lean towards using it in a very limited, judicious way, so that we don't cheapen the word and we don't cheapen the experiences of people who suffer violent suppression for their faith. That leads to the seventh and final pitfall, which is employing language that alienates. We want to use language around helping the persecuted and promoting religious freedom that encourages rather than encumbers our cause. And I acknowledge in the paper that the very term I use throughout the paper, religious freedom, can be alienating to some audiences. In the West, those on the political left can be quite suspicious of the term. They may be suspicious of religion itself as a category, and also the word freedom has come to have something of a partisan tinge for some readers. And then outside the West, the term may be viewed as very foreign and threatening. So we want to find terms and concepts that resonate rather than alienate, that open up conversations rather than close down conversations. Now let me conclude with some of the practical implications that I just touch on at the end of the paper. I ask the reader a series of questions that hopefully will spur them to reflect on how they engage. I ask, when we speak about or pray for the persecuted, are we exemplifying biblical ethics, the golden rule, and so on, and the best of the Christian tradition? When we see an article in the Christian press about persecution, or receive an email with a funding or advocacy appeal, as many of us probably have in the last few days, related to the persecuted church, we should ask ourselves these sorts of questions. Does this article or appeal exaggerate the problem, or show undue partiality to Christians? Does it disparage non-Christians or neglect their suffering? Does it evidence symptoms of a persecution complex or employ language that alienates? And given that the Sri Lanka attacks are fresh in our minds, we can ask these sorts of questions in relation to information we receive about the situation in Sri Lanka. Does the article, does the appeal exaggerate the problem? It's hard to exaggerate what happened, but one can create a misleading picture of what's going on more generally inside Sri Lanka. Does the article or appeal antagonize Muslims or somehow blame Islam for what happened? Does it neglect the pervasive problems faced by Muslims in Sri Lanka, the attacks by Buddhist nationalists on mosques and Muslim-owned shops, for instance? And does it use language that might alienate or further inflame tensions? And my hope is by asking these sorts of questions and by recognizing and then ultimately avoiding these pitfalls, we can have a more constructive and productive championing of religious freedom for all people everywhere. Thank you.